first hybrid event, I believe. So presumably the first of many, given the state of affairs. But it's also good to be welcoming people online who are joining us today. Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. And we are very delighted to be welcoming Eva Horn, who is professor of modern German literature and cultural history at the University of Vienna. She's also associated this year with the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, which I think you've been enjoying very much as an opportunity to concentrate fully on her research interests, which are many, and many reasons to be here today and to look forward to her talk for us. She's the author of a number of different books. I'll just mention a couple. The Secret War, Treason, Espionage, and Modern Literature, which came out in 2013, and The Future as Catastrophe, Disaster, Imagination, and the Modern Age, which came out with Columbia in 2018. She has been a visiting professor of German at NYU and also at Columbia, and she's the founder of the Vienna Anthropocene Network, which is also of interest. We have a lot of connections actually with the University of Vienna, and we've had a lot of visiting fellows here from the institution, so it's really nice also to renew and refresh those relationships. Just a few words of thanks. Thanks very much to David Kelly, who's kind of set things in motion for this hybrid event, and we hope the internet connection and all the rest holds up. To Matthew Garrity, who's our intern working with us this year, to Ivana Donahue, and of course to Martha Shaughnessy. We're also working in effective collaboration with the Humanities Institute at UCD. The invitation came from Anna Fuchs for you to come to Ireland, and a chance for us to take advantage of that visit. So I'm delighted you would make your way further across the country. And this is your first time in Ireland, you're saying?
Yes.
Excellent, good. Okay, without further ado, I'd really like to hand over to you. Your title is there, Being in the Air, an Intellectual and Aesthetic History of Climate. So Eva, look forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for inviting me to my first visit to Ireland. I will be talking about a research project I'm currently pursuing and hopefully get to some bigger results during the year at Wissenschaftskolleg. It's a topic I've been working on for a long time, but then interrupted with a book you didn't mention, and I just have to give that as a background. I recently wrote an introduction into the concept of the Anthropocene. And so in a certain way, what I call the Anthropocene diagnosis, or the predicament of realizing that natural history, or the history of the planet and the history of human beings and their culture and their technology have kind of collided, as Deepa Chakrabarty calls it. We have to think about items in a humanities perspective that in former times we would have assigned to the sciences, the natural sciences. So air or climate, which I use for historical reasons in a certain way as synonyms, because for a long time, and as Dan is here as the 18th century expert, in the 18th century, for instance, climate and air are used completely synonymously, or rather, air is what we today would call climate. Climate is very often just limited to a geographical term, which would mean region or latitude. I'll get to that later. But the air as a topic, or climate as a topic, has to be, in this moment we're in now, has to be addressed not just as a topic of the sciences and as a problem, as a factual problem that, as Bruno Latour pointed out almost 20 years ago already, a matter of fact that has become a matter of concern, a matter that has become contentious, problematic with climate change, with air pollution and other pathologies of the air. I believe, we need a humanities and a historical approach to this topic. And this is what I'm trying to do. I try to write what one could call a history of the air, or history of climate before climate change, ending up, of course, in climate change. But first of all, I would like to understand why we have completely forgotten about the air, why we're not concerned with it anymore, why we even think linking culture and climate, for instance, is a problematic thing, and why we have relegated such an existential matter as the air or climate to the sciences and thereby exteriorized it. Oh God, okay, so if I don't put my finger all the time on this thing, it's gonna, yeah, so this is the table of contents of my talk. Yeah, I just realized I don't have a clock, and that might last for until midnight. Maybe I get my cell phone to, I don't know, just say, let me know when I'm 30 minutes in, because I can't stop myself once I'm in my topic. Okay, so first of all, I would like to give you a specific kind of criticism of the scientific approach to climate that we're dealing with today. As an author of a book on the Anthropocene, I'm the last person to have a kind of humanities critical post-humanism type of criticism of the sciences. The scientists are my friends, and I owe them a lot, and I'm deeply engaged with what they're doing. I have no reservations whatsoever to the way in which climate science studies climate and explains it to us, and it gives us very, very necessary knowledge about what's going on with climate change and so on. I would like to point to specifically the link as a problematic link between what we know scientifically or through the sciences and how we can address it as citizens in policy, but also as humans who walk the planet and have the wonderful saying that there is no bad weather, there's just the wrong clothing. This saying to me epitomizes the way we deal today with problems of weather, of air, of climate, and we relegate it to the natural sciences, and that has a price. So let me start with the scientific definition of the climate. It's in an appendix of the third IPCC report. It's also, wherever you look, it's that definition, today's definition of climate. Climate, in a narrow sense, is usually defined as the average weather. I will talk about who came up with this because it's from my home country. It's from Austria. It's an Austrian meteorologist of the later 19th century who defined climate that way, as the average weather, or more rigorously as a statistical description in terms of the mean and variability of relevant quantities over a period of time ranging from months to thousands or millions of years. The classical period is 30 years. So what do we have? A definition of climate that is essentially statistical or mathematical. We're dealing with averages. We're not dealing with concrete forms of perceivable, of experience or perceivable climate phenomena. We're also dealing with a global average. When we talk about climate change, we usually talk about global warming, which again is another spatial abstraction. So the way we deal with climate today happens on a temporal scale that is way beyond human experience. It happens on a spatial scale that is also global and cannot be experienced. Climate classically can only be experienced in a specific location. And so our conception of climate is more like this. We have graphs, we have this type of imagery just showing how between the 1950s and the 2010s, which regions are warming most. It's a totally abstract way of giving us an idea of what global warming means. We can tell, obviously, it's a little bit worse in the Arctic or in northern Central Asia, Siberia and so on, than it is, for instance, in Middle America. But in general, we get this very abstract idea, even more abstract, global warming as a graph. All we can see is obviously it's getting warmer, it's really inching upward. And so the question is, what do we need? It obviously is extremely hard when we think about the last 30 years when we already had robust knowledge about climate change. How could we relate to climate as a matter of concern, but also as a matter of perception, as a matter of our history, as a matter of identity? How can we do that complementing the scientific view? So what I'm trying to do is really kind of the other side of it. It's a humanities complement to what the scientists are doing when they research climate, both in a historical perspective and in a way to simulate what's going on with climate change. So I would like to give you, and that will be the biggest part of my talk, what was climate in former times? How was climate addressed? What dimensions of human existence were related to climate? And what can we learn from that? But also, where were the problems or fallacies of this ancient kind of knowledge? So let me start with climate and human health. Firstly, in Antiquity, air was one of the four elements. And framing the human body in the theory of the four elements meant framing the body within a cosmos that was consisting of mixtures of these elements, and also seeing air, as much as water, as much as earth and fire, as parts of the human body, which means a human body that is completely open to the environment. Let me give you a very famous text that usually is taken as the beginning of environmental thinking, and it in fact deals with what we would call climate today. It's Hippocrates on airs, waters, and places, peri eron hydaton topon. And this is the beginning of the text. Whoever wishes to investigate medicine properly should proceed thus. In the first place, to consider the seasons of the year and what effects each of them produces for they are not all alike, but differ much from themselves in regard to their changes. Then the winds, the hot and the cold, especially such as are common to all countries, and then such as are peculiar to each locality. So you see the emphasis is really on locality. There's a tension whenever antique authors talk about climate, there's a tension between a very specific idea of a locality and the bigger context of the oikomenia, the known habitable world. But I'll get to that later. We must also consider the qualities of the waters. In the same manner, we ought to consider its situation, how it lies as to the winds and to the rising of the sun, for its influence is not the same whether it lies to the north or the south, to the rising or to the setting sun. So this text is essentially dealing with climate as a form of environment that defines human illnesses, but also human general bodily constitution, typical illnesses, even mentalities or mindsets that are framed and shaped by the environment. A second step from the Hippocratic relation between environment and the body is miasma theory. It comes out of a Hippocratic and then Galenic idea of illnesses. It means miasma means stain, and it is the idea that the earth constantly carries all sorts of matters, exhalations of the earth, but also pollen, sweat, smells, gases, anything, mostly stemming from processes of decomposition, but also just the exhalations of animals, the exhalations of other human beings. That is miasma. And the idea of miasma theory is whenever you have an epidemic disease, it must come through the air because it's shared by everybody who is in one and the same spot. So we're far away from any idea of contagion, pathogens jumping from one carrier to the next, but saying whatever people share in terms of illnesses must come through the common air that they breathe. Then there are the ideas of sicknesses coming through winds, the seasons. The 18th century which still finds itself in this tradition of Hippocratic medicine, has a very acute idea that any kind of weather phenomenon can make you sick. And so people start, as of the beginning of the 18th century, they begin keeping weather diaries or trying to match their own weather measurements with the state of their bodies, their illnesses. And eventually, in the late 19th century, we have colonial medicine that revolves, say, around the question, which human beings can dwell in which region of the world. Then we are dealing with extreme climates, mostly tropical climates, and the question, is the white race, are people from, say, England, able to adapt to a totally different climate? Let me give you a few quotations. That's the one on Ireland. It's by Alexander Pope writing to Jonathan Swift. If I lived in Ireland, I fear the wet climate would endanger more than my life, my humor and health. I am so atmospherical a creature. The atmospherical creature, the notion that Pope coins here, is very much the idea that 18th century medicine has of the human bodies. The different states of the atmosphere, even social atmosphere, but still in a rather literal sense of air quality, infringes on the whole personality, the moods, the passions, the state of the health, physical health, but also psychological health. The person who wrote one of the most important treatises on this question is the Scottish Dr. John Arbuthnot in his essay concerning the effects of air on human bodies. It's basically a summary of everything that's known at the beginning of the 18th century about the air, very much in a Hippocratic fashion, but he also includes new research on the physics and chemistry of the air. The other point with this notion that the air is directly involved with human health is the fact that any state of the air is intensely perceptible. So the air can be smelled. Let me just give you as an example another quote from Arbuthnot. In summer, the air is replete with the perspirable matter of vegetables abounding, with volatile spirits and oils, which perhaps stimulates and accelerates the spirits, and that of some plants is too powerful for some people who cannot support the smell of some of them. So we have plants this season, again the idea of exhalations impregnating the air and then infringing on somebody's not just health but also emotional state. It's stimulating and exhilarating, but it also can make you totally melancholic and sick depending on the season, the composition of the air, and so on. Another thing is feeling the air, and here I quote from Montesquieu's, the 14th book of his treatise on legal theory or political theory. And in this treatise, which is famous for all sorts of things, but infamous for his climate theory, he writes that any political system has to be adapted to the temperature of a locality, because a cold air constringes the extremities of the external fibers of the body. Consequently, it increases also their force. On the contrary, a warm air relaxes and lengthens the extremes of the fibers. Of course, it diminishes their force and elasticity. People are therefore more vigorous in cold climates. Here, the temperature of the humus is greater, the blood moves freer towards the heart, and reciprocally, the heart has more power, and so on and so forth. Put a man in a warm climate, on the other hand, for the reasons above given, he will feel a great faintness. The inhabitants of warm countries are like old men timorous. The people in cold countries are like young men brave. So you see the immense effect that is attributed to the state of the climate, in this case about how you bodily feel, but also how you psychologically feel, and then how you act. And on this basis, Montesquieu, who I will quote again, develops his theory that political systems have to be adapted to the state of the human beings that dwell in a certain region. Then you can also see the air. It's just one image of many that is from the 19th century, and it bears already the marks of modernization, of the ubiquitous fumes and smokes and steam clouds that mark the industrial revolution at the atmospheric level. But you see what Turner is trying to do, and I think he's trying to do this throughout his entire work, is trying to paint the air. Another one of my favorites, Adalbert Stifter, who is a poet, an Austrian poet. What is not so known about him is, I like to use his text, and I will give you one quote, but he's very famous as a poet of nature and how to describe nature, but as a painter, he does the exact same thing. He's trying to paint the air. It may start with Caspar David Friedrich, you know his work probably, but I think Turner is the most expressive of an artist who tries to convey the fact that air is by far not an immaterial thingy that we never feel, but that in this older tradition of climate is something that is intensely present and perceptible. One last thing on the health effects of air. It comes from the context of miasma theory, but here is my beloved Austrian Adalbert Stifter. He writes a text which is more or less contemporary to the Turner picture I showed you, 1844, on Vienna and the specific weather and climate of Vienna, urban air. Our forefathers built this city so densely, this is my translation, sorry, it's not translated, that it happens at times when I open my window in the morning in Vienna to let in fresh air, that all I get is the night air from my neighbor's bedroom, who also has opened his window and wishes me a good morning. So you see that miasma theory is bad enough in itself, but when it comes to densely populated cities such as Paris, such as London or Vienna, it becomes also social atmospheres on infringing on my private atmosphere. When I breathe in the morning, I breathe in my neighbor's exhalations. So my second point is very short. That's the only slide. The second aspect of climate is that in its origin, it's a geographical term. Roughly speaking, one could translate it to latitudes. However, I'm giving you this D'Agostini map because it shows very much a still relatively ancient idea of climate and of space marked by certain climates. You see these little angels, these are the winds. These are the big winds blowing around the globe. You see even the New World and the Old World, and you see they are latitudes, but what is important about the latitudes, that from antiquity on, latitudes are grouped into zones. And the term zone will then be very often used as a synonym for climate. Instead of saying a cold climate, you would say the septentrional zone or something, or the cold zones. Antiquity has 7 zones. Sometimes they're morphed into 5 zones. Sometimes they're only talking about the northern hemisphere. Sometimes they talk about the entire globe. But the idea is always that climate is essentially defined by the angle, and this is the etymology of the term, by the angle of the sun hitting the ground, and they're having longer or shorter days, stronger or weaker seasonal patterns, and so on. So that is for a very long time the real meaning of climate. In the French encyclopedia, for instance, it's just translated as contrée, which means region. So my third point is probably the most contentious one. It's that from antiquity on up into the early, even 20th century, but with a decline at the end of the 18th century, climate is set in relation with culture. Or to put it even more bluntly, climate is seen as the cause of a culture. It's called climate theory. You find it in Aristotle, who already says in Asia they have a very mellow climate. Asia meaning Persia in the ancient days, or Little Asia, Turkey and Persia. They have a very mellow climate. That's why people are not so brave. In the north of Greece, they have a colder climate, and that's why people are complete brutes. But we in Greece, we don't have it neither too warm nor too cold, and this is why we are so smart and so brave and good warriors and have the perfect policy. It's a figure you find very often. You do not find it in Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, which is probably in modern, say, the last 300 years, it's probably the most famous climate theory. And I will give you a little bit of a better idea what Montesquieu is trying to do. He tries, based on this very crude idea that the body reacts essentially to temperature and unavoidably to temperature. The body is determined by the surrounding temperature, which is a very, very reductive idea of what antiquity or Hippocratic medicine meant by climate. As you could see from the Hippocratic treatise I gave you. Montesquieu has the idea it's all about temperature, and the temperature defines the state of the human body, and the state of the human body defines the state of the human mind, and that has to be taken into account when you think of the laws that Commonwealth needs, a society needs, or the social institutions that they need in a given climate. In cold countries, they have very little sensibility for pleasure. In temperate countries, they have more. In warm countries, their sensibility is exquisite. So you see in a very typical 18th century fashion, he moves from this very crude physiology of temperature, he moves to something else, which is sensibility or sensitivity. Essentially, it's this notion of sensitivity that Montesquieu's climate theory is revolving around, but still, if you have these more sensitive human beings in the south and the less sensitive human beings in the north, these two would need different social, or will produce different social institutions. As climates are distinguished by degrees of latitude, we might distinguish them also in some measure by those of sensibility. I've been at the opera in England and in Italy, where I have seen the same pieces and the same performers, and yet the same music produces such different effects on the two nations. One is so cold and phlegmatic, and the other so lively and enraptured that it seems almost unconceivable. So based on this idea that human beings can be more or less sensitive, Montesquieu tries to conceive of what we today would call cultural diversity. What climate theory does for the attempt to talk about cultural diversity is, I think, twofold. On the one hand, by linking cultural diversity to an environment, it tries to create a notion of human existence that is context specific. One could also say it's a kind of materialist approach to even highly religious authors such as Baudin. I mean, people who really are Christians. They try to take kind of an idea of God created human beings this way out of the picture by giving a more contextualized or using a more contextualized, naturally contextualized notion of the climate, of a culture. The other thing is, when we think about climate being a type of geography, it also creates some order, because this is a spatial order. And if you say, well, say this is Greek culture, this culture is different from that. The Brits or the Germans, who are normally, as they are dwelling in the north, the brutes of climate theory, which doesn't mean they don't have good sides. They're reliable, they're honest. If you want to know anything about what climate theory thinks about the Germans, you just read Tacitus, because everything that Tacitus writes about the German then has a 2,000-year career throughout climate theory. But the idea is that you can make a map of cultures. This has, of course, its dangers, and I'm coming to that. But let me just give you an alternative idea of what that could mean. Maybe no. Let's talk about the dangers first and then get back to my beloved Herder. How much time do I have?
It's about 30 minutes.
Oh my God, yeah, okay. One of the dangers is, of course, what I already explained to you, the idea that there is a norm, there is a best climate, and then there are problem climates. One proponent of this, but certainly not the inventor, is Immanuel Kant. The inhabitants of the temperate zone, particularly those in the middle of the temperate zone, in the temperate zone of the temperate zone, it's always about the middle of everything, are physically more beautiful, more hardworking, jocular, more temperate in their passions than any other species, Gattung is the word in German, of humans in the world. That is one danger, that from this map, all of a sudden you say, this is good and this is bad, which is pretty much what happens in the 19th century. The Africans always come come out, or the people in the tropics come out as the lowest rung of human or climate culture connection. But it doesn't have to be that way. The other problem, and I'll rush through this a little bit, is the question, how do you, in the 18th and especially 19th century, when race theory emerges, how do you relate this environmental theory to the idea that you have innate traits that are inherited? And so we talk about races as opposed to climate, or a link between what one could call climate determinism and racism. These are the dangers, and you can see all that already to a certain extent in Montesquieu, but you can always also pitch it or frame it differently. And that would be my favorite climate theorist, Johann Gottlieb Herder, in his Outlines of a Philosophy of the History of Men, end of 18th century. He has the idea that not only climate has to be understood both in a global and in a local way, down to the smallest microclimates, but that culture is not just formed by or shaped by climate, but in turn, human beings through their culture also shape the climate. So you have kind of a feedback loop. This is what this quotation is about, as climate is a compound of powers and influences to which both plants and animals contribute, and which everything that has breath forms as an all-encompassing system, which is very, very much a totally modern or contemporary idea of what climate is. The atmosphere is a system that is part of a bigger system, which is the Earth system. So in a certain way, Herder has this idea of an all-encompassing system that links every place on the globe to every other place on the globe. There is no question that man is placed in it as a sovereign of the earth to alter it by art. Ever since he stole fire from heaven and rendered steel obedient to his hand, ever since he has made not only the beasts but also his fellow men subservient to his will, he has contributed to the alteration of climate in various ways. Once Europe was a dank forest and other regions were the same. They are now exposed to the rays of the sun, and the inhabitants themselves have changed with the climate. So in Herder, you do not have this relatively determinist climate change is a culture, but you have the idea that there is a process of exchange or mutual transformation between nature and culture. I will skip the 19th century and maybe also the aspect of climate as time, just to give you an idea. Climate is a reminder through the seasons, through the diurnal cycle and the seasonal cycle, or even bigger historical ideas of cyclical time, such as the Platonic year or cyclical history. Climate is a reminder of the fact that within the linear idea of human historical time, there are recurrent patterns, or in some cases that what we think is linear human time is in fact part of a bigger cycle. So you have Nicolas Poussin's attempt in the Four Seasons to picture the a synthesis of mythical time and historical time, cyclical time, and linear time by the Four Seasons that depict every time scene in the Bible. But let me just jump through this and come to my conclusion, because this is really important. Now, if this stuff that I presented strikes you as a bit outdated, you're perfectly right, because in the course of the 19th and 20th century, this idea of climate disappears. It's superseded by new forms of knowledge and new forms of new disciplines. And I would just like to give you a few hints to what is it that makes the air disappear or constitutes the end of the air. Firstly, of course, it's the research on air and climate, understanding air as a chemical mix of gases and not as a uniform element, separating organisms, not just the human body, but all other organisms from their environment by analyzing what goes in and what goes out. So the chemistry and physics of air change entirely, and that happens already in the 17th century. In the 19th century, we have a new understanding of climate as a meteorological phenomenon, starting with, in the second half of the 19th century, systematic measurement and computation of weather throughout the entire globe. Measurement is being done already throughout the 18th century, but it wasn't linked together. Paul Edwards' A Vast Machine is this science history of this endeavor of creating standardized data sets of climate. And with the Austrian climatology, climate by Julius von Hahn is defined as the average weather. In medicine, human beings cannot be understood as deeply formed or also made sick by the air, because the body, we have an idea of the body as being completely separate of the air. However, there's a long tradition, even well into the first decades of the 20th century, of going into healthy air and healthy climate by the sea or in the mountains. So this is something that is fizzling out slowly. One scientific step that you can demarcate quite precisely is the creation of germ theory by the likes of Louis Pasteur or Robert Koch, which eventually refutes miasma theory. Throughout the 19th century, you have kind of a parallelism between the notion of contagion, one organism giving a pathogen to another organism, and the notion of miasma, the thing floating through the air and being inhaled. But with Pasteur's and very specifically Koch's isolation of the cholera pathogen, bacteria, miasma theory is kind of put to rest or thrown in the garbage. That means pathogens can be separated from their medium. The idea that air is a medium of illness, of epidemics, it disappears once we can separate the pathogens from their medium, or we can designate vectors such as mosquitoes, rats, and so on. So germ theory puts a nail in the coffin of miasma theory and also of what one could call a meteorological medicine. Then in the social sciences, the likes of Montesquieu or Herder are refuted by the idea. First, explicitly, maybe explicitly, we talked about this yesterday, proposed by David Hume, but basically as a standard of social sciences. It's one of the sociologists who really explicitly says we cannot link social phenomena to natural phenomena is Emile Durkheim in his book on suicide. He said there may be seasonal patterns of suicide waves, but we cannot attribute that causally to the seasons, but we can only explain social phenomena through social factors. So we have more energy in the spring in the social fabric, and that's what makes people more suicidal, but not the climate. So today, whenever somebody comes up with it's the weather or it's the climate that makes this and that society efficient or inefficient, everybody would say this is epistemically not tenable, and we're still living with this. Geology is another nail in the idea, in the coffin, that the idea that climate shapes our temporality. Lyell gives a new explanation of Earth history as a very incremental, gradual process that is linear, slow, and irreversible. So forget about cycles. My last slide, and I'm done. The air is dead. Now it does return with a couple of phenomena. I just can enumerate. Of course, air pollution. We have places in the world where air pollution is so sick to really account for quite a big factor in mortality and health and disease. We have climate change, and we also have a way of questioning climate science, climate change denialism, that in a certain way also, I'm not making any case for climate change denialism, but I would suggest to take it as a symptom to the abstraction of climate science. We need to frame climate in a different way in order to make it more graspable. We have new findings in so-called biometeorology, how certain illnesses are not just caused by air pollution, but also by states of the weather. We have recently had a pathogen that was, in fact, floating through the air. And I would say the first 6 months of COVID research were lost because with miasma theory in their backs, they was like, no, that is pure miasma theory. Had we had a miasma like Sydenham or a real staunch doctor who represents, or Arbuthnot, miasma theory, I think we would have had less difficulties to understand the transmission of COVID, which is in fact an airborne pathogen. We have a new found interest in non-Western cosmologies, framing humans in their environment differently, not externalizing the environment, but trying to find, maybe in a Herderian fashion, cultural ways to negotiate with the environment and not just externalize it. And last but not least, my favorite subject for the past 3 years, the Anthropocene, which is in fact a collision of natural history and human history, and thus reminds us of the fact that even an elusive medium of life such as the air cannot just be cast outside of the realm of politics, of culture, or individual well-being. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Eva, very much. I'm just going to sort of circulate this way. Many different questions and possibilities there, so I open the floor to questions. I certainly have a few that I'd like to ask myself. Maybe Rebecca. Yeah.
Oh, well, I have a whole load of things I'd like to say. Can you hear me okay through the mask?
Can you maybe take it off? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm able to speak better myself. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And I particularly liked the way at the start you pointed to the fact that you like science, scientists are your friends, it's not as sort of an oppositional, here are all the things that are wrong with scientific approaches and this is why we need the humanities, because that kind of a way of framing one's research, I think it's a little bit too easy for people in arts and humanities to fall into that, so I really enjoyed that. But I'm maybe just going to provocatively flip it on my head slightly and say, there's a slight danger when you're kind of going through the history of science and things that people thought scientifically and all the different ways that you set out, which is really fascinating. There's a slight danger, it looks like you're picking up the bad science. The science that actually it turns out was not really correct, but you're interested in the way, different ways people thought about things scientifically. But it turns out that's a kind of a cute way of thinking about the climate, but it's not really true. But that's a cute way of thinking about how diseases unfold in human bodies, but actually medicine has moved on. So how do you get around the potential charge that, well, that what you're doing is just picking up the bad science and finding it culturally interesting? I think you do, but I'm just interested to hear you say a little bit more about it, because at one point you sort of said, so this, what they're actually doing was using science to express ideas of diversity, I think you said at one point, and trying to explain the world. And I thought that's a really interesting idea, because maybe what you could start to argue is they're not really interested in the science at all. What they're trying to do is express something about how the world works, and they turn to this kind of pseudoscientific vocabulary, but actually their interest is elsewhere, and that's what you're looking into. But anyway, that's just a question on.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a very important question. Firstly, I would say there's no such thing as bad science. So proponents of miasma theory, they were totally cutting edge at their time. I do not have, and that's one of the things that really takes me very far away from my friends in the sciences. They always say, yeah, but now it's wrong, and we know it's wrong. And no, it's. I would not say there is old, bad, obsolete science, and now we have the cutting edge. I would say this is really wrong. We need to take into account or take serious these older forms of knowledge. And that's where you have a point, because obviously I wasn't very good at explaining why I find this so interesting. Yes, I like climate theory, even though it's riddled with epistemic problems. In the 19th century, it oddly merges with racism. It has very, very jingoistic ideas inside of it, but it's a way of thinking through diversity. It's a way of thinking through environmentalism, or a human, not environmentalism in the modern sense, like we protect blah, 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 we throw our garbage, not in the forest, but about a relation between humans and their environment, and that human culture or civilization cannot be understood separately from environment. However, this is maybe the red thread running through all our intellectual history of modern thinking, starting with maybe someone like Hobbes and his political theory, which is, you will not find the word climate in his Leviathan. It's an idea that we have a universalist understanding of the human being, completely independent of environment or of cultural differences, but humans have these and these capabilities, they have these and that interests, and logically speaking, they need this and that model of power or social order to enforce peace on these single players. Baudin or Montesquieu would be the opposite, and what I find appealing in their political theories, they have long chapters on climate, is that they would say, no, humans are not the same everywhere. Different systems, depending on where they live, need different types of political order or social institutions. Herder comes up with the idea that culture has to be understood as a way of not just dominating or exploiting nature, but feeding into nature and getting feedback in return, like a cyclical interpenetration type of model. That's what I find so interesting. But you are right, one of the difficulties of this project is that there's a lot of stuff lumped together, and I wouldn't be a serious, or say, if you want to do a serious type of intellectual history, you can't just pick out the cherries. And that's one of the things that make my project so very complicated, you know. Many people do that in the humanities, like, oh, this is it's not so easy, but I really do try to find the cherries or to, in a different metaphor, to tell a different story. You know, I'm trying to come up with a storyline that says it's not just in the indigenous lifestyles out there. They have different cosmologies, like Discola style. It's super interesting and wonderfully inspiring for my project. But what we have today in the humanities is kind of a projection onto the noble savage and non-Western cosmologies, and they do it all right. And Western thought is just a disaster and leads us in the Anthropocene. It's like, no, within Western thoughts, there were people who were onto something, and this something was this very atmospherical notion of environment.
I might just follow up, if I may, with a reading suggestion then. I don't know if you've come across Caroline Levine's work, Forms. It's a book from 2015, it's called Forms, and it's something like, the subtitle is Whole Hierarchy Rhythm Network. But the point of her book is, so she's coming from a literary studies sort of starting point, but a bit like yourself, she wants to explain, something much bigger about how the world works. And her project is, she wants to say, what can you take from literature that can help us understand much broader social phenomena? Are there things about actual close reading of text that we can apply into a much broader understanding of the world? So when she says forms, she starts out thinking about how we organise literary text, but then it's like, how's the world organised? And I'm actually thinking, maybe there's something going on in your project that you're sort of saying, well, what's the sort of the readings that were going on in the context of climate science, and the concepts that were developed in the context of climate science, that maybe you could take out of climate science and apply to explain why, how the world is sociologically or some such. It's a sort of a slightly inverse, coming from the science into the more humanities perspective, whereas she's going from the heart of literary studies out into kind of sociology, I suppose. But,
yeah, I came across the book. I haven't read it. Thank you. Yeah, I'll look into it. Thanks.
Sue? No.
Can you take off the mask?
Sue, can you, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. In fact, it was extremely provocative, I thought, and it made me think of a lot of things, particularly when you're moving into your literary aesthetic examples and so on. I wondered if one way of approaching the literary side of things, which I believe you are at some point, is to think about the history of the development of the skeptical subject in poetics and narratology. And I'm coming at it here from a late 19th century, early 20th century perspective, and so your examples of Turner and so on going into Impressionism are really exciting. But it actually made me think of Conrad and Typhoon. I kept thinking about the way in which so many of those turn-of-the-century authors, often associated with colonialism or post-colonial perspectives, are thinking about the extreme states of experience of the human as the human encounters the web, or encountered in particular climactic states. in fact the human subject drops out of typhoon altogether, and there's a silence in the text. So, I mean, this goes right through all sorts of modernist aesthetics, as I'm sure you're
Yes.
I just thought, thank you very much for stimulating that idea.
Yes, I have been thinking about giving you examples from colonial climate theory. Conrad is, I don't know the typhoon text. Of course, one could take a couple of clippings from Heart of Darkness to just show how hot climate is almost as a way to create a totally different mental state, the highly unreliable narrator, Marlowe, his way of not really perceiving things in an orderly fashion, but whenever I read Conrad, I think, oh my God, my English is obviously not good enough. I didn't really get the plot. What's going on here? And I said, no, it's just not, he just doesn't tell me. It's like very impressionistic. And I would think, especially in the impressionism or haziness of the way the narrator functions in Heart of Darkness, he's trying to convey this idea of heat, putting everybody in this kind of surreal state of mind.
Impacts on the corruption of the body itself. It was very Dantean.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a chapter I still have to write, so I don't have answers.
I have two questions that are perhaps connected. So the first is, I think a lot of fantastic work has been done regarding, for example, connecting the literary production of the time between 1600 and 1850 in relation to the Little Ice Age, for example, and how climate influenced, or especially the climate shifts as they become colder, kind of impacted on people's social sphere, literary production, etc. In a way, it's easier to do that when you look into the past. What I would be particularly interested in is what can literature studies do when projecting things into the future? Like, how can we have a contribution in terms of interpreting projections? Because when we see a shift where the disadvantage is that things got colder and life became more complicated and harvests failed and how life became more difficult, can we make assumptions on similar but kind of but also different projections to global warming?
First of all, my book is not on global warming. In one of the later chapters, I will have to address the question. Yes. There's no way around it. Global warming or thinking about changing climates is totally not new. Already in the 18th century, you have Dubois, for instance, who talks about certain periods when the climate was good and culturally productive, and then later it wasn't. Maybe looking back at the 17th century, but the text is from 1719, so it's 17th century, and they're still kind of on the Little Ice Age is a very difficult climatic period. There is research, but when you are going through a 150-year period of changing climate, you don't know it's the climate. Another example, which is much more has the more like the shape of a crisis or of an event, is The Year Without a Summer, 1816. And I have worked on that in my catastrophe book. There is fantastic cultural history research by John Darcy Wood, for instance. And there you have a climatic pattern that changes from one year to the next. 1815 is everything is still okay. 1816 it's not, and they cannot make the connection between Tambora and snow in July at Lake Geneva, and there you can really try to show the indirect impact of a climatic event onto poems such as Darkness by Lord Byron, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's The Last Men, to a certain extent. But my project is, I think, different. I am not trying to demonstrate the impact of changing climates on certain literary texts. I am trying to write a history of knowledge and perception, and a history of systems of knowledge. So it's rather an intellectual history project where I sometimes step into such examples as you just mentioned. But it's a slightly different project. As for climate change and projections, the projections that my beloved colleagues from the sciences make on climate, they are not, you cannot approach them with humanities means. They're in a computer and they're graphs. And what you can do, and this is done extensively, is write climate dystopias. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it should be about communicating how these graphs are perceived in.
They're not perceived at all. No, the question is, how do you communicate this type of knowledge? You can do two things. And it's got nothing to do with science. Either you write climate change dystopias, like Bacigalupi and so on, and there's ample research on that too. And there's one novel coming, Clifey is like every week there's a new novel coming out. So I'm not that interested in that. The other thing is, how does science communication work? We have robust knowledge of climate change for the last 30 years. When did politicians wake up? First of all, because it's now here, the flooding in Germany and stuff, but also because it was boiled down to the level of school children. And that is Greta Thunberg's work. So this was the moment it was translated into very, very simple messages, and it was taken up by a generation of people that have no saying, that have no voice politically, and they cannot vote. They have no saying whatsoever, and they took it and they went to the streets and they brought the topic on a not very scientific level into their families, and all of a sudden it's a social movement. I think that tells us a story about the inability to convey complex scientific findings to an audience at large, but also I think it teaches us a very important political message about people that will have to, I have to say this in German, die Suppe für uns auslöffeln werden. You know, those generations who will bear the brunt of climate change. It's not us, it's our kids. And why do they not have a voice? And what is going on in the families? People who have, I don't have children, but I have friends with children, and they have discussions about flying and what to eat all the time with their kids. And that's how you do science communication. And I'm not saying that in a deprecating manner. I just think, wow, that was, we need the wake-up call of a kid to finally swallow the pill.
It's an interesting point, because there's also certain almost slightly folkloric dimensions to this with Greta Thunberg of the wise child, the seer, the vates, who can, precisely because of their innocence and youth, see relationships that are hidden to those who've been acculturated in a certain kind of way. What if I could ask a question maybe more about the intellectual history side of the project and kind of go back to the 18th century? And it would be, you know, too crude a reading of your position to say that you're finding intellectual resources in the past, but nonetheless, you're trying to identify vocabulary that existed, which does create its own set of possibilities. I was thinking particularly of Montesquieu and who is, in many ways, seems quite eccentric, and his attachment to this theory seems, curious in one sense. The point I wanted to pick up on is that his vocabulary is also a moral vocabulary, and even the sensibilité is not just actual sensitivity; it's a moral, it's a moral feeling, which is possible, and we know how that develops in the 18th century. So, do you think that morally charged vocabulary is something that we need to redevelop and maybe renew in some fashion? We know, as you pointed out, that it can also head in problematic directions by privileging certain locations, and it was certainly said of Africans that they were insensitive to climate difference, for example. So I don't know if that's a helpful way of putting it, to say, look, what moral vocabulary that connects us to the climate would be available to us in this moment, or whether you just really want to frame it in a different way.
As you pointed out, the anthropology or the anthropological model of the 18th century, especially in Montesquieu, is very far away from our idea of the human. This whole sensitivity or sensibilité idea is not how we would frame human beings along a line of sensitivity, and I don't think this can be renewed. You tell me. You're the expert. But I think what one has to do is pick out those aspects, thinking about diversity, thinking about the necessary connection between politics and culture and environment. But what is the hardest to translate into something that appeals to us is precisely the moral vocabulary. The gender theory in the spirit of the laws, it's just ludicrous. I mean, it's beyond ludicrous. It's all about how temperature is either sexually very arousing or it makes you sexually completely insensitive, and that's why you have to have an idea like romantic love, and you have to have booze in order to progenerate in the northern countries. The whole Pierre Bourdieu famously said, this is in fact, this is all rubbish, he would have said, and it's pseudo-scientific, and he says, in a certain way, there is a gender theory in this moral vocabulary, framing the southerners as female and the northerners as male. If you take this approach to a text like Montesquieu, you can't do anything with it. Really nothing at all. One thing that he doesn't have is this kind of also this centrism that I pointed out with Kant, the idea that it's only in the temperate zones where you can develop any kind of higher civilization. Montesquieu doesn't have this. It's because in the end of the day, even though it sounds very physiological, this whole calling the fibers and stuff, it's rather about this sensitivity thing. And what makes him then interesting again is the idea that, and maybe that's the main point, where is human freedom? Montesquieu is really kind of saying goodbye to the absolute monarchy models of Hobbes and Buddha, and say we need checks and balances. The three forces need to keep each other in check. So where is human freedom in a world that is very much influenced by external natural powers? It's the freedom to make laws that help us resist the forces of the climate. It's again this idea of freedom is in the checks and balance model, in the relation, and this is where human beings can find a way out of the climate or being determined by the climate by, for instance, having, like the Chinese, a legal system that, even though it's very hot in the country, the legal system takes us out, and the religion takes us out of the slump of heat and forces us to be vigorous and hardworking, or not us, the Chinese, to be vigorous and hardworking. So I think that this idea of freedom, how do we define freedom not outside of nature, human freedom outside of nature, but as a resistance to nature or as a negotiation with nature? Maybe that's the we have in the modern age, as of the 20th century, it's like the legal system is a social thing that has to refer to social facts, but not to the weather. And maybe we need to rethink that. And maybe this idea of, resisting the weather, or going, or, having laws that just makes you give into the climatic influences, makes the political system better or worse. But it would be thinking about the human certain degrees of freedom, not freedom as an absolute good, but what are the human degrees of freedom in a given environment.
Any other further questions? I don't want to impose on you too much. The richness of the topic had obviously detained us for a very long time. So maybe just draw things to a close there, and to thank Eva very much for this talk, the importance of which is we know every day. I was thinking as you're presenting the quotation from the Vienna Wetter, so we have the Galway Wetter to admire as we look out the window, which seems to be closing at the moment. So thank you very much for coming here, for talking to us, and developing our thinking on this topic. So thank you very much.
And thank you for your questions.